We're going to start with the Subaru Forester. In this case it's 2014. We're going to change the left rear wheel bearing. The wheel bearing in this case comes as a complete hub. So it's basically a 4-bolt pull off and a 4-bolt screw back on. You just have to take a few other things off. First of all, you jack up the car, obviously. Jack stand it so it's safe. You can jack it from the differential without causing any damage. Take the wheel off, that's fairly obvious. This is what that hub's going to look like. This is a used one, but the new one looks the same, it's just shiny. So we've got the wheel off now. Next we have to get the brake caliper out of the way. Instead of taking the caliper hand off, we're going to take the whole thing off with the 17 deep socket from behind. Basically 2 bolts. Take them off and then you can swing the whole caliper out of the way, or up, tie it up out of the way. We're just balancing it, but to be safe you might want to tie it up there. Don't damage the ABS line, electrical line. Okay, we've taken the brake rotor off. Now we're going to take the axle nut off. Helps to have a heavy-duty gun in this case. Again, what we really want to see here is on the back there are 4 bolt holes. We're going to next take these 4 bolts out. You can access them with a deep socket. The axle's really not in the way. First we're going to break them loose, then we're going to use a little electric ratchet to unscrew them all the way. You're going to see this video is roughly 8.5 minutes long. If you know what you're doing here, it really doesn't take more than 15 minutes to change this wheel hub bearing if you have all the right tools. This is that electric ratchet I was telling you about. Very effective in new tools without having to use an air supply. Once you get all 4 bolts off, the hub bearing pushes lightly into a hole there in the spindle. However, it gets rusty over time and you may have to use a hammer to lightly tap it out of that spindle hole. Okay, now we've got the bolts off. See, it doesn't pull out, so we're going to get a hammer here. Tap, 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 tap. Working your way around a little bit. Get it loose. I suppose you could use a slide hammer here and lightly slide hammer this hub out. Depends on how much rust you have in there. Once it's loose from the spindle, it's still going to be stuck to the back plate. And if you can just swing the back plate down, you can have somebody hold the back plate with one hand, and you can tap the bearing out from the back, tap it out of the backing plate. here it comes. We've swung the backing plate out, and although you can't see it very well, you'll be able to very easily see the back side of the bearing hub and tap it through the brake back plate. Here's the bearing out. If you spin it with your hand, you can hear noise. If you hear any noise at all, that's a bad bearing. You're not supposed to hear any noise at all. Now we've reversed the process. We've basically lined up the bearing back into the back plate, back up to the spindle, put the 4 bolts back in, reverse the process, and bolt it back together. Obviously, putting it back in is the reverse of taking it out. Very simple. We spray a little spray grease onto the areas that had the rust just to make it slide in a little bit easier. Once you get the bolts for the bearing hub tightened, be sure they're very tight. Then we're going to put the brake rotor back on, and then the brake caliper. Slide it back on, match up the caliper holes to the spindle, and bolt those back on. If you've done brake work, this is no big deal. It's just something you do all the time. We just skipped a step by leaving the whole caliper and the slide assembly together. The last thing you have to do is put the spindle nut back on, and you're going to want to torque it, if you have a torque wrench, to about 177 foot-pounds. Once you've torqued it, you can get a hammer and a punch to lock that spindle nut back in place. Lock that spindle lightly. There's a little groove at the top of the axle nut. You can lock the axle nut back to the axle. And last, very simply, put the wheel back on. No brainer.